Yeah, there's a separate button for YouTube for some
That's
reason.
so interesting. Yeah, this is where I get tripped up. I'm like, I'm used to Twitch. Now that should be working. All right, all right, all right. Okay, cool. Great. And then I'm just going to announce it on all the places, and then we'll start with some intros and all that stuff. Does anybody have a hard stop at 10 or anything that I should be aware of?
I do.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to make sure that I asked that before so that in case we go over, I can remember not to. So that's no problem. Thank you to everyone who is waiting in the chat for us to get some technical difficulties sorted. All right. And I'm just going to ping our... All right. Okay. Let me switch over so you guys can actually see our speakers. All right. There we go. Oh, we got is in chat today. So, all right. So I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about sustainability of open source today. I'm going to get all of you to give a little bit of a background on who you are, what you're doing, like what you do now, what got you into open source, and like kind of your journeys there. And then I think it'd be really, really interesting, especially given, so both Abby and Film Girl, you're both at GitHub, correct?
Yep. Yes.
I think it'd be really, really interesting to talk about sustainability in open source and like monetizing open source. And I know that Muesli, Carlos, and TJ are all very like active maintainers of different projects in open source. So I think it'd be like a really interesting conversation to have there of like sharing both sides of the situation. I think that'd be really nice. And I know that it's a question that kind of is coming up a lot just in general on the internet. So I think that would be definitely worth discussing. And that's kind of the game plan for today. So without further ado, I'm going to start I'm going to list out who's going in what order just so that there's a lot of us on the call, and I know it's already really hard with like latency and stuff not to like talk over each other. So I'm going to try and assist with that as much as I can. So let's start out with Muesli. You want to talk about your experience, like what brought you into open source, what you're doing now, and all that good stuff?
Sure. Hello. So I'm Muesli. I'm actually Chris, but most people call me Muesli online and offline. And I'm an open source developer for, I don't know, more than 20 years now, I guess. Some of my earlier contributions were actually to PHP and MySQL. And that all started out in the 90s. So it's a long, long time ago. and back then, it was a different scene, actually. So I was starting out with a little website and I was experimenting with CGI bin stuff. And that back then meant you compiled your own little C programs that people could then call and access via the browser. And then at some point I discovered, oh, there's PHP. And this probably makes a ton more sense because CGI bins were super painful, right? And then from PHP, I went down the entire LAMP stack, essentially. So I ended up with MySQL and contributions there as well. And then eventually I started getting into KDE, Qt, Amarok, and things like Docker and Nextcloud. So it's an ever-growing list of contributions and projects I get interested in. And that's the beauty of open source, right? Whenever you find something that suits you, that excites you, there's a chance you can be a part of it, you can contribute. And that I found that super exciting as a teenager, because that meant so many opportunities to learn things, and not just from a book, but actually from real life examples and how do other people solve certain things. And that was super exciting. Yeah. that's how I got into open source.
I love it. That's awesome. And Abby, did you want to talk next?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Abby Kabunak-Mays. I lead GitHub's open source maintainer program. So it's a lot of supporting this open source ecosystem and talking to maintainers who I think bear the brunt of a lot of the work in open source. So glad to have so many maintainers on this call. Really trying to support you all. I'm also on the board of the OpenJS Foundation, and I'm an organizer for Sustain OSS. So I care a lot about this topic. So huge thanks for having me here. I love thinking about the open source ecosystem. For your other prompt around how you got into open source, I started my career in cancer research.
Oh, wow.
My grandmother had passed away from cancer. So this idea that I was helping researchers sort of innovate, and I was writing software for them to help them, find therapies and find solutions. And it was really meaningful work for me. And Muesli, you mentioned CGI. My boss, coincidentally at the time, he wrote CGI PM. So I was doing a lot of Perl with bioinformatics. And the longer I was working in academia, the more I realized how often people sort of like hide their data or fudge their data just to like get the best results and publish faster. And that's why, I really care about open source now, and just seeing how open source can really change how we do work and how we innovate as a society. And even just seeing my bosses like CGIPM, he went on to write a lot more scientific software that like made big impact. That was a huge inspiration for me. So that's when I actually joined Mozilla, where I was the developer for Mozilla Science. So just helping scientists do open source. But then over time, my role like shifted to be more about open source generally. And now I care a lot about the open source ecosystem and just helping it thrive.
That's great. That's a very unique entry to open source. It's like through cancer research.
Oh, yeah.
That's so interesting.
There's a few of us. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay. And TJ, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm TJ. I guess my entry into open source was through NeoVim. I was a college student at the time. I didn't know anything about programming, basically. You know how it is when you're in college. And I also didn't really understand anything about open source in any like meaningful way or anything. Just one of my buddies who was at an internship was like, dude, check out this NeoVim thing. You can like write plugins in Python. I was like, well, that's cool. I don't know. I know Python. And like this idea of being able to write code to help me write code better was exciting. Like, that's really cool. I want to try that out. And then I was just like doing stuff with that. And then I wanted to do something with my status line, and it wasn't possible at the time. So in my ignorance, I was just like, I don't know, I guess you can just write code for that. So I just found an issue on NeoVim. I like submitted a PR. I don't think I knew how to do anything with Git. I think I just like copied a bunch of random stuff and pushed it. And a bunch of people on the NeoVim core team were super helpful to me. They taught me just in that like one PR, I got like a whole like life cycle of like programming stuff about how to manage Git, how to do rebases, like how to write tests, what are good tests, stop writing dumb comments that are just saying like add two numbers together. Like, yeah, obviously just look at the line below, it's adding two numbers, like all this kind of stuff that you think, oh, that's what I need to do. I learned like a lot of things just from that one PR. And so then I was like, well, that was really cool. I don't think I understood how cool it was that those people took time out of their day to help me and whatnot at the time. But that experience really stuck with me. And over the years, I contributed a lot more to NeoVim, particularly around like the LSP client and Lua integration with NeoVim, which are sort of like some of my favorite parts of NeoVim. Probably uncoincidentally, that was why I was super motivated to work on them and ship them. And so then I was eventually added to NeoVim core, and I've been able to do a lot of really interesting stuff in NeoVim. And then over the past 2 years, I guess I started streaming a lot of my open source work because of the Primeagen. He was like, you should just stream what you're doing. I was like, oh, that seems crazy, but okay, if you say so, buddy. And so I was, one of the goals that I was trying to do through that is just this idea kind of like open source out in the open source was kind of like the term that I was using, which is really fun for people to be able to see and participate. And you can get really quick feedback from users or other stuff like that normally takes like months, because you're like, waiting for people to have time to reply in a PR comment versus like they just hang out on the stream and they're users, and you're like,
Yeah.
does this make sense? And everyone's like, no, that doesn't make sense. You've been using this for 10 years or whatever, for 5 years. You're not putting enough context into this or whatever. Like, oh, that's really helpful info. So that's kind of how I got into open source and some of the stuff that I'm doing with it today.
Awesome. Yeah, that's how TJ and I met, was through streaming. So that's fun.
Yes. And we've done lots of really fun collabs.
Yeah, we have.
And hilarious competitions as well. So maybe we'll talk more about that later. I don't know. Fun stuff.
If any of you have YouTube channels, by the way, like let us know, because I did tag the GitHub channel and I tagged TJ's YouTube channels. But yeah, so if you wanted to see the collabs that I did with TJ, that's all on his channel. And then if you want to see some of the stuff that Film Girl, she hasn't spoken yet. If you want to see the stuff that Film Girl is doing, she's got some incredible videos that she's creating on the GitHub platform. So there you go. And
highly recommended everything. Yeah.
It's really good. I'm like, oh wow. One day I'll be there. And then Carlos, did you want to? Let's get you on next.
Hello, I'm Carlos. I also started on open source while in university. At the time, I created like a GWT plugin that was like a component wrapper for Bootstrap, which were both like things at the time, and it kind of got out of hand a little bit, and people were using it, and I was like, first time in my life speaking English with people in other countries, and I didn't know English, so that was fun. And over time, I contributed on several other projects here and there, like Muesli says, like things that catch my interest for one reason or another, and it was really helpful. I think it helped shape my career as a programmer, and also like the jobs I take or not, and all that. And recently, I'm working mostly on Gorlizer, which is a tool I created, and I've been maintaining it for the last 6 years, I think. And yeah, pretty
amazing tool.
Very good tool, yeah.
I hope so. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. I love that. And then Christina, aka Film Girl, which one did you prefer that I call you on the
Either.
show? Either or. Okay.
You can call me Film Girl. That's fine. Yeah, either one. Whatever's easier. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Christina, aka Film Girl. Like Abby, I work at GitHub. I'm a senior developer advocate. And we work a lot with the community, both users of our software, but also people who are part of the open source community. That's a big part of what we're committed to at GitHub. Before I joined GitHub, I was actually at Microsoft, also in developer relations, but there actually the last year I was at Microsoft, I was actually focusing on Linux, which the irony is not lost on me at all. And but that was actually really interesting because when we talk about sustainability and when we talk about, how we can make this something that can go on, and also maybe like what the role corporations have, both in maybe giving back, but also in potentially lifting up, but also, have to be careful, like not, swallowing all the oxygen in an ecosystem. That was some really really interesting experience, especially in a place that historically Microsoft has not had a great relationship with. And so seeing how even big companies that used to have a very negative association with open source can change, and can internally, especially, like that's like you hear like the talking points, to me that is what it is. But when I was actually working with engineers every single day who were dedicated to working on open source and were paid to either contribute to bigger projects or their own things, or to contribute to things like the Linux kernel, that was really gratifying to see. I first kind of became aware and involved in open source probably in high school. Is probably I loved the web, and similar to a lot of the other stories, you like use Perl or PHP or MySQL, and you're like, okay, I want to build my website, and oh, there's a better way of doing this, and people have contributed this thing that's free. Oh, but I can also get help, and if I make changes, someone else can get benefits out of it too, right? Like it was just something that was really gratifying to me. And there used to be a platform, might still exist, I don't know, called LiveJournal, which was like Tumblr, but for like old people. And that the guy who created that, he was and still is very active in open source. He's he's at Tailscale now, but he was actually one of, I think, the original Go team members. But back in the day, like, he would write a lot about the things that he was building and doing to keep LiveJournal up and running. And this is like the early 2000s. And that was one of those things for me that really kind of unlocked the whole like potential for me as well as the community. So but I love this topic, and I love the fact that I like that we're going to be talking about keeping things sustainable, because like Abby, who is so focused on these things, like maintainers are so important, but we need to make sure that this is an ecosystem that can continue to thrive and that people don't get burned out on.
Absolutely. Yeah, and from what I've seen as well, it's like it's kind of like pulling teeth trying to get people to support their open source tools that they're using. So like either by sponsoring the project or by sponsoring the maintainers or any of that stuff. So I find that quite interesting, and I try and it's an interesting problem. And so I know that you mentioned that, so Microsoft, like, I'm not very familiar with the internal workings of Microsoft, of course. So that's very interesting to me how they are paying some of their developers to be working on open source projects. And how do you feel that it increases, I guess, sustainability when not only larger companies are doing this, but smaller companies as well? And like, do you think that in Microsoft being such a large company, starting that kind of initiative, that will help support smaller companies that are considering making their code base open source? And then another question that I just want to put out there before I forget is, I also think it would be really interesting to talk about why, like, our own speculations of why we might think that some companies are hesitant to make their code open source. So, Film Girl, I'm going to start you with that first question.
Sure.
With Microsoft. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great question. And I think that I definitely do think that it can encourage smaller companies if they see the examples of larger companies. I think Google, we should give them a lot of credit, because I think in terms of the big tech companies, they were probably the first one to really be all about open source. I mean, Mozilla obviously was kind of founded on that, right? Like, there was the code base that Netscape famously open sourced, and then that became a thing. But if we think about like what we know about as still existing tech companies that are like giants, like Google was really early with that. And I think that what we saw happen was that Google thrived, and I don't think that it's any small coincidence that they thrived, because a lot of their stuff was in the open. And because they were able to take both take advantage of work that other people were doing, but also contribute that work back upstream. And I think for me, like, that's the core thing. Like, as you said, it is kind of this interesting conundrum where you have a lot of people who rely on open source projects and then don't have any way of really supporting them back, whether that is by paying for support contracts, or hiring developers to work on it full time, or doing sponsorship, or dedicating people to handle QA stuff or testing, or to even have like PMs, right? Because that's, or documentation. Those are roles I think that we don't talk enough about in open source. We all think about, oh, the only way I can contribute is by submitting some code, when really having people who are involved in governance and docs and managing the projects is just as important. But that costs time, and can cost money. And I think when you have larger companies who can really actually contribute and meaningfully participate, that can be really, really good. I think the challenge, I would say, and this is that when I look at big companies and how they're participating, what I hope more of them would do, and that this would be what I would hope smaller companies especially could kind of maybe even do this as well to help encourage, is that it doesn't become just a one-way conversation. Because to your second question, which I won't answer, but I have a lot of thoughts about like why companies don't open source things. One of the challenges I think sometimes with bigger companies is that if they are, is it open source in name only, right? Like, are they, just throwing the code over a wall, but not actually
Mhm.
caring about engaging with the community and other users who might be upstream? Is it just something where they're like, here's my source code? And in some cases, maybe that's all you can do, and that's okay. But I think where it can be really beneficial, and this is where I think big companies have a really big opportunity, is if they can actually engage and if they can actually participate. Like TypeScript, speaking of Microsoft, I think is a really good example, because that was a Microsoft initiative. The community is really active, and a lot of the things that started with TypeScript, which is now 10 years old, which blows my mind because I remember like it was yesterday when it launched. A lot of those things are now officially part of the ECMA standard, and have made the entire JavaScript community better. And that, I think, is like a really good example of how you can Go is another example too, right? Although that obviously has a lot more kind of focus from one company. But when you have these things that you can continue to give back to, and like in the case of TypeScript, it can actually become something that the larger ecosystem then adopts officially. I think that's a really good example for everyone, and that's what I hope that larger companies who have this platform and these resources that a lot of others don't can do.
Yeah, I think it's a learning process for many of those companies as well. And the older they
Sure.
are, the harder it is to swallow that lesson. And I hinted at earlier, I was like, I'm coming from a time end of the 90s where open source was it was just starting to become a thing, right? There wasn't really an open source scene. There wasn't a GitHub. There were just a bunch of projects that just followed that strategy. And then, as you mentioned, Google being one of the first examples that jumped on that train and rode it for a while. They have changed a bit since then, but yeah, I think it's a learning process. And back then it seemed outlandish, it seemed crazy to just open source an entire product that you paid developers to work on for months, for years, sometimes. Yeah, and companies felt like that's giving away my entire IP, my entire tech stack. Open sourcing that's the worst idea you could suggest right back then. And then, but nowadays, imagine there's not a startup that could thrive without open source. There isn't a Netflix, there isn't a Spotify without open source. They're all building on that tech stack, and so are many other companies. Sometimes not even realizing that they are. Building their entire foundation on open source. Yeah, that the developers know about that, but the management might not even realize how much they're depending on open source and all those projects. And so I think that's a learning process as well. Once they realize how dependent they actually are, and the future of their company, how dependent that is on the maintainability and sustainability of certain open source projects. I think then at that point, it's an easier sell, right? Supporting an open source project for those companies, that typically means that's a fraction of a developer's salary, right? If you support an open source project with $100, $500 a month, that's a fraction of a developer's salary, and it goes a long way. And if more companies start doing that, then it also changes the open source scene again. How you can actually approach maintaining those projects, how you can maintain them, how you can make a living out of them. Yeah, but we're just getting started with that, I think.
Yeah, one thing to add. Well, first, a few weeks ago, I got an email from LiveJournal, so they are still around, telling me that my account's been around for 20 years. So that that made me feel very old.
Okay. Yep. So mine's about the same age, so that's fun for both of us. That's great. That's great.
Another thing that's interesting, I was actually interviewing Carlos for a different panel a couple days ago, and he was saying that most of his sponsors are not the big companies; it's the smaller ones. And I think part of it's the bureaucracy. It's hard to get a big company to decide to move it there. And the smaller ones also realize how much they're relying on open source a bit sooner, I think, than the big companies do. But this conversation has me thinking of this framework of open practices that the Mozilla Open Innovation team put out a few years ago. But there's a few different benefits for a company running open source software. And I don't think you can get all of the benefits at once. It depends on the type of project. So the first is like, by giving it away for free, you have more adoption. So things like Android, like they don't have a big community of people contributing code back, but because it's free, like it's a standard on everything except the iPhone. So it's interesting how like by giving it away, everyone just can use it. The next one is like lowering your development costs. So if you have like your contributors or you have a big support community answering questions, so that lowers your costs for that. and for development. And then the third is like a better product through a larger pool of innovators. So like having a big pool of contributors, you can like build something that you wouldn't be able to as a single company. So those are things I point to when companies are like, oh, why should I open source this? And I think there's real good like market reasons to open source something.
Another reason would be acquiring talent, right? You're talking about those experts that you're building in the communities. Those are the best hires that you can imagine, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. I'm very curious. So it seems like community seems to be an underlying theme here of like why companies are open sourcing, and like a big benefit of it is obviously the fact that you're building that community. So I'm curious, when all the projects used to be like closed source, and do you think it was maybe just because there was less maybe competition for any given domain at that time, and they didn't feel like they needed to necessarily like engage their community as much? Because now, as you mentioned, it's like all these tools, it's like you kind of need to be open source. The community wants to feel involved, and if they don't feel like they can be involved, they don't feel like they have ownership like stakes in the project, or that they can give good feedback, that it's just not as valuable for them, or they are worried that it might get if it gets like, you know, killed out by the company, what now? They're going to be left high and dry. So I'm very curious to hear if anybody has any thoughts on that.
I mean, I do have thoughts on that. I think one part of, let's break this down a bit. If you're building something today, that's entirely different to how it worked like 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you had your standard library of your programming language. You maybe had like one or two libraries that were proprietary that you actually bought and paid licensing fees for. And then you started building a product with that. Today, pretty much anything you touch is going to be so much more complex with the internet involved, and so many APIs and interfaces that you're typically providing. There are so many moving parts. It's pretty much impossible to build something without open source. I'm not sure how companies still do that. I'm sure Microsoft can do it, and I'm sure Google and other big players can do that.
Apple.
But as a regular company, you couldn't do it anymore without open source, and I strongly believe that. There's no market anymore for proprietary solutions if there is an open source competitor that's way better maintained, where I'm guaranteed that this library will have a future, and if it's not by the original maintainers, I can pick it up and still maintain it myself. So for me as a developer, I'm always looking for an open source solution first, because typically that's a much better solution for me. Yeah. And that the same goes for companies as well.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry, go on.
Oh, okay. I'll just push back a little bit on that, because I think like using open source and having your product be open source are like super different things, right? Like,
Okay,
I mean, I do work for an open source company. Like, all of our code's open source besides deploy. You wouldn't want to put all of your deploy secrets in open source, right? So like, there's still reasons why you wouldn't. And some of those things cost money, right? To you, right? Like, that costs developer time to make sure you don't leak secrets, to make sure that these are all those, okay, now you got to have a DevOps team. Like, okay, if you close source, no one can, you can commit your secrets. Oops. Oh, well, you know, like there are costs, right? To doing that. And I think like for us, sure, maybe in terms of like a library that we would want to use, like I would be really hard pressed to find a case where I think like, yes, I'd much prefer that closed source library over the open source one that I can go investigate the source code. But in terms of like, just like in pushing back on it a little bit for like products, like I'm not thinking, oh, I can't wait for Netflix to be open source. Like, that's not really like, I don't, I mean,
Agreed.
maybe I'm just not pure enough. Okay, whatever, that's fine. I mean, I spend a lot of time on it, but like, I don't care. So I think we should just like make sure we're being particular about like what kind of use cases we're talking about, because like for a library or for like different things, maybe things that deal with your company's code, you know, like I work for a code search tool, like you might want to be able to read the source code to know what we're doing with that. Sure, that's fine. But like for Netflix, oh, sure, maybe Netflix could be a better company if they were open source. I don't know. That's a difficult hypothetical.
But that's not even quite my argument, though. But Netflix itself is still using tons of open source components, and they're releasing tons of open source components.
Yeah, but Bash was asking why not open source your product, right?
Okay,
those are different questions. That's like those are very different. Like
totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And I think you bring up a good point. Like one of the reasons companies don't, I mean, I think, and this was especially what you were talking about, Muesli, like earlier in kind of the iteration of open source, a lot of people were like, why would I give up my IP? People are going to steal my product. People are
Yeah.
not going to do this. And you still hear, I still talk to a lot of startups, especially in certain parts of the world. I'm not gonna like. It's interesting because there's certain parts of the world that are full on embrace open source. There's some parts that still, I think, have that fear of like my product is going to be stolen out from under me. Someone's going to just recreate it, and I'm not going to pretend like that's not a valid fear. I'm not going to pretend like we haven't seen, especially in the software as a service era, things like Elastic, where
Yeah.
people do have maybe genuine fears that if I make this available to anyone, someone else can create a hosted version or change a couple of things, and all the work that I've put into it can go away. But
Mhm.
I think that one of the other challenges beyond that, and I think that a lot of people have shown that even with those risks, you can still have sustainable and profitable companies that are using open source components, whether their whole product is open source or not. I think one of the challenges, and I think you brought this up, Tej, is there is a cost to doing it. And I think that that's something we don't talk enough about when we talk about sustainability. We talk a lot about that, I think, in terms of community and maintainers, which is super
I think
important. It
it
looks
was
like we lost
Christina.
Carlos. Um, but I think that, so we talk about sustainability a lot with maintainers, but there's also a cost, especially with smaller companies, but even bigger ones, even big companies, have small teams, which is if I'm going to open source this, do I have somebody who I'm dedicated to keeping this up to date, to keeping the
Mhm.
security things there, to taking in pull requests if that's what needs to happen, to documenting what's going on, to making sure that this code can actually be used by others, because a lot of times things that we write for our own projects are really messy. And if you're going to release it out at open source, there is this sort of weird expectation that it is going to be usable, right? Whether that's fair or not. And there's a cost to that that not every company, big or small, can always take on. And so I think that it's a good thing when you can give back, but I also understand sometimes why. Like I know at GitHub we have a lot of things that are open source, but we are not like all of GitHub is an open source. And one of those challenges, it's not even necessarily a philosophical thing. It's just like the reality, which is making all that available to so many other
Mhm.
people would require a level of commitment from us that we don't have the resourcing to support the way that it would need to be supported. And that's a challenge.
Yeah, and I'll just also
Yeah.
say too, like in terms of like, okay, you release a library that you're using internally, you make it open source. You want to
Yep.
make a breaking change. Well, at
Yep.
work, you yell at all your, yell, but you know what I mean? Like you just get all the
Yes.
teams in line and you say,
Yeah.
6 months from now, we're deleting this API.
Right.
So I'm gonna face to face each of you and tell you that's coming 6 months from now. If I want to do that for NeoVim, how do I get people to
Yeah,
like
you
delete this
don't.
from their code? They can't.
They,
Right?
they, they
Like
can't. And then yeah, and you have to deal with the consequences, right? Even
right.
if you decide to make that breaking
Yeah.
change, like you have to deal with the consequences of the support request coming into you, people who are angry with you, right? Like, is there going to be like a hostile fork situation? Yeah, you're
Mhm.
right. That creates a lot of other concerns sometimes.
But we like open
Yeah.
source still, so we could talk about the sustainability part. I didn't mean to I'm sorry, I took us on a little tangent about some of the stuff that I think is difficult for companies. But I just want to be fair in our take about like it
Mhm.
can be okay to, and it can just be difficult to make something meaningfully open source, like in any way.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, Film Pro, like just you just make it open, like you show the code, but no one could build it. You're like, okay, well, I mean that's maybe still better, but it's
Yeah.
still like maybe it's still better, but it's still
Maybe.
difficult. Yeah.
I'd be
Yeah,
very
and sometimes the project gets like abandoned there, like people open source, the company open source the project and it works kinda, but they never update it or like just leave it there. So it's
Or don't react
I
to
don't know how
feedback,
useful.
contributions,
Yeah.
issues, stuff
Mhm.
like that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'd much rather you just kept it closed than have abandonware.
Yeah. I don't know, but yeah, probably.
Yeah, that's really true. I'd be very curious to hear first from the maintainers, and then hearing from the GitHub team. So about sustainability in particular. So if there are things that you've found already through your own experience that have helped you be able to contribute more time to your open source projects. I know that I'm pretty sure all of us are employed by like open source companies. So Obviously, we're getting paid to also maintain open source projects, but I know that each of you have projects that you aren't getting paid to maintain. And I'd be very curious to know if you, like, one, already have existing kind of strategies in place, or the resources like that you have that are allowing you to continue to maintain these projects, or if you have any ideas or like brainstorming a little bit about different things that would be nice, or that would make you feel more supported as a maintainer. I feel like that'd be a really interesting conversation to hear your side first, and then hear from the GitHub team about what they're working on and their reaction to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll just say I think GitHub sponsors has been a huge win for this. Not being sponsored to say that, even though there's GitHub people on the call. But for
Thanks,
me,
Chief.
that's been a really big win, because one, it's like really low friction for maintainers. So it's like
Yeah.
maybe I'm already on GitHub, or like my project's mirrored to GitHub if I'm using something else or whatever. It's really easy. You put the little button, it like has a little button, you can click that, and it's easy. And I also like that people feel confident that all the money is going to the dev, which is really cool. And that's been really nice. And so like can make more sense for people to give $1. Like kind of sucks to like give $1 sometimes on like Patreon or like something else. Nothing against any of those other platforms, but it's like I give $1 and they get like 30 cents by the time like fees
Yeah.
and blah, blah. You're like, oh, that kind of stinks, like, or I got to go make a separate account, all this stuff, right? So I think like that's been a really big win, both that you can sponsor orgs and like individual devs. And like I have a lot of sponsors on GitHub that I've been super thankful for, and that's like been motivating. And like it's just rewarding to know that people like it enough to give me $1. Like, oh, that's really cool. I'm like so thankful, and it's like really exciting and makes me like happy to know that people do that. I think there's still like a lot of innovation left in that space though too. That would be really interesting to see. Things like, let's say you host your project on GitHub and you have a list of dependencies. It could be interesting to like for a company to say, we want to give $10,000 a month to open source, and GitHub automatically distributes those to the dependencies that they analyze in your project, or things like that. I think that could make it a lot easier sell to like companies. They don't have to individually sponsor projects, which is like a risk, of course. Like a PR risk, a like monetary risk. You find out that that person's like not the kind of person that you'd want to sponsor. So like there's interesting things that could be done, I think, in the space still remaining to make open source like, oh yeah, okay, we use these 100 JavaScript libraries. Let's just we're committing to spend 10 grand a month to like these open source that gets distributed. And there's some stuff in that space I think going on too, but it'll be interesting to see what happens there in terms of like just being able to like fund some of those things, because that's sometimes all people need for it to be more maintainable, sometimes, or sustainable. Like sometimes you need something else. You need users with kindness in their hearts, or like companies that aren't mean to you, or like abusive like relationships with you and your software, right? Those are sometimes needed as well, right? Sustainability isn't just about money, but money can certainly help. It can fix a lot of problems, at least.
I agree. It's not just about the financial situation, right? Sustainability also can mean that you're starting out with a project, it becomes more popular than you ever maybe intended, and now it takes a lot more time investment than you ever planned for. And then a project can also become sustainable by finding new contributors who are sharing that load and taking work off your shoulders. So that means you have to give away responsibility to other people, to long-term contributors. And that typically is a good way to make a project more sustainable as well, because maintainer burnout is a real problem in this open source scene, right? And that's part because the entire donation flow to those open source projects doesn't exist yet. And that typically means maintainers have a real day job, and then they come home and they keep maintaining their open source projects. And sometimes that's like having 2 day jobs. So that doesn't work out in the long term, obviously. That's bound to fail at some point. So yes, making them independent from a day job, if the project is popular enough and you find enough sponsors that you can actually treat that as your day job and do open source full term, that's the dream for many, many people, I guess, but we're just not quite there yet. I'm sure TJ is probably the exception. I'm not sure how many sponsors you got on GitHub, but I'm sure you deserve every single one of them for all the
Not
work you
enough
do.
to quit my job by
See,
a
that's
long
my
shot.
point. And I feel
Not
for
that I'm
everything
looking
that
to.
you do. But all the work that you put into NeoVim, you should get to a point where that's certainly an option for you. At least I feel that should be a reality sometime in the future for you. That you at least have this option. Yeah. And then, yeah, it's not just financial things. Make the project inviting for new contributors. Yeah, make it public, promote it. Be responsive when people send you issues and contributions, and then in the long term that pays off, because that means you attract new people that are willing to share the entire workload with you.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And since you already spoke a lot about the money aspect, I would like some magical thing about governance. I don't know exactly what or how it looks like, but I would like to have like something that resolves like permissions and sharing work and all that for me somehow magically. I don't know how, but yeah, some magic there, because that also takes a lot of work, like sorting through issues and like all that, a lot of duplicated issues, documentation. I think all open source, I think all projects, open source or not, have the issue of like having good documentation, which is really hard to do, like how much exactly you write about each topic. Now that I don't know how to fix any of that, but I'm certainly hoping someone finds something that helps.
I think one of I made a fuzzy finder for NeoVim called Telescope. It became really popular. I was very surprised. We just made it on my stream and we were just exploring some ideas and it became really popular. And one of the things that happened is there are some people who got involved with the project who really like doing that kind of stuff. And if you encourage them and I think also help give them ownership of the project now, that can be it can go poorly. I think maybe in the next 10 years we may see just difficulties in ownership of projects as they become more popular and like automatically inserted into people's worlds via dependency, supply chain, blah, blah, this kind of stuff. But for me, I make plugins for NeoVim. That's my open source thing. Nobody automatically installs those. They have to write that themselves. So like, I don't have to worry about a bunch of these things and no one makes money off plugins. So like, that's easy to do. But like I had, just some people get involved with the project that were interested in doing that and like moving them up to like they are a maintainer in the repo. Like I just gave them permissions after a while and like I trust them. I mean, I check on what they're doing and they've earned that trust. And I think doing things like that and finding people, it depends on the project, but some people are interested in doing that, but they get treated not even just badly. Like I think a lot of people are pretty nice in how they treat them, but just like not giving them more agency or more like, oh, like you think that should get fixed? Like, okay, like you can do that. I'll let you merge it. I don't have to review. I trust you, you know, like we wrote some tests. It seems good. I think doing kinds of things like that can be really helpful for your project, but sometimes you just have to get lucky and find some people that are interested in doing that for your projects.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
Before we keep going, I know that Abby's on a tighter timeline, so I'd love to hear from Abby before she has to go about what you've just heard.
Yeah, it's super exciting, super interesting to hear what you've said, because I do think, a good technical writer, a good designer, product manager, project manager, those roles are a gift to open source projects. So I think Christina was mentioning before about like non-code contributions to open source. I think those are excellent places where you can contribute, and it's so helpful. And to what you were saying, Tej, I think the 0MQ project used to just give every contributor that came by, just give them full maintainer, full admin access, and just like full trust right away. And that created a really interesting community where people like did things and trusted each other. Not every project can do that. You probably need some code review somewhere sometimes. But I think it's a really interesting way to model it. But for open source sustainability, Tej, you were talking about, just funding your whole dependency stack. So back in June, GitHub experimented with this for a maintainer month. So we had $500,000 that we just split up across all of our dependencies, everyone who was on sponsors. So there were about 900 at the time. So that gave everyone a bit a bit over $500 US each. And I think that was it was a really interesting experiment just to see like could we do this across all the dependencies. And maybe you should stick around for the universe keynote and see if there's there's maybe something coming up around those lines.
We'll be there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. Breaking news.
Yeah,
Stay
exactly.
tuned.
Stay tuned.
Also happy to keep our channels updated. So like Abby, if whenever you get the any info for that, let me know, and we'll very happy to share that and repost and do all that stuff. Make sure that the people know what's going on.
Yeah, of
That's
course, I'll
awesome.
pass that on.
Perfect. Okay, keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, those are the main things I had, but yeah, those are my main reactions to what everyone said. But it is great to hear from the maintainers. Oh, the other thing that I've been hearing a lot, maybe not in this conversation, but just what maintainers are looking for just to keep going is just more maintainer connections. Like it's a lonely job. You're often doing this by yourself or with like a very small group. So that's something I'm thinking of. Just what kind of communities can we build for maintainers, or what can we do just to help you learn from each other and apply best practices and just sort of help set you on the best legs to become sustainable.
Agreed.
That's not to like interject too much, but like that's one of the things that's been super fun about doing like live coding and
Yeah.
live streaming is like
Nice.
now I don't think you need 10,000 viewers, right? Like if you have like 10 dedicated viewers, that can be like your own little community working on your
Yeah.
project, and you're hanging out working together, and that can just be super fun. Like I know
Yeah.
that I've done a lot more for NeoVim because I stream than I would have otherwise, because I just have more fun like hanging out on stream, goofing off with friends, making Twitter memes, like posting random gifs and reply to people, and like that's all funny. Or like someone makes a PR from stream and you're like, this is your first PR ever? That's awesome.
Yeah.
Like, and that's just like, so I think there's like all these interesting ways now that the internet's becoming more ubiquitous that we can explore to find ways to do like what you're saying, those connections, either like maintainer to maintainer or maintainer to
Yeah.
contributor or maintainer to user. I have a bunch of people who just like use my plugins. They'll never contribute anything back, but it's like fun. It's like, hey TJ, thanks for Telescope. And I'm like, thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
That really makes me happy.
That's great.
Oh, that's awesome. I hadn't thought of streaming as an option for that community building. I do have to
I
jump,
hadn't either.
but I will. Yeah.
Yeah.
so much,
No, I was gonna
Abby.
say I think that's great. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Abby. No, but I
Bye.
think
Thanks, Abby.
that's actually like thank you, Abby. No, but I think that could be a really good solution. Streaming, I mean, not for everybody, but I think that you're probably right? Because Abby and I have talked a lot about this, and I would love to hear from the other maintainers like your thoughts too. But she's right; like it can be lonely, and it can also sometimes be demoralizing, right? Like you get a lot of positive signals, but I think what's hard for being a maintainer, and I've helped with various projects, but I've never been a sole maintainer before, is that now you're kind of responsible for more than just yourself, which is what I was kind of trying to talk about before, like why sometimes companies don't open source things is because you're now responsible for more than just you, right? Like there's this expectation, like Teach was saying, if you make a breaking change, it's impacting more than just you. And people aren't always super
Absolutely.
nice, right? Like,
Yeah.
like I think that's something that we as a community can do is to be like, even though a lot of people are sponsored by their companies to work on things, that doesn't mean that everything they do is being paid by someone else. It doesn't even mean most of it, right? I mean, a lot of times the things that we do for love are not what we're getting paid to do, right? Like we might be being paid to work on something else, which is great. But we're the things that we're putting a lot of our sweat equity into, we're not getting paid to do, and that's certainly true for the three of you who are so active in this space. And people aren't always nice, and maybe that's something we can think about too, in addition to having communities like streaming, which I think could be a great way to both commiserate with others and also show a little bit more humanity about like, hey, I'm not this huge corporation. Because a lot of times people think that, right? They think, oh, you have 20,000 stars on GitHub, you must have like 1,000 employees, and that's not true, right? But sometimes it's one
NeoVim
person.
can't afford one full-time dev a year.
Right. Which that in and of itself right there, I think is a great point. The fact that NeoVim can't afford one full-time dev a year and is used by how many, like probably millions of people, and is such a popular product and such an important thing. I think that most people assume, oh, it's so popular, it must have the resourcing, both financial and otherwise. And then that means that sometimes you are a little bit, you can have higher expectations and be entitled a little bit, right? And so maybe like we recognize, hey, a lot of times these really popular things are maintained by very small groups or one-off people. I don't know. Maybe that could help. I don't know. Just if we all could be a little more human.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I found really interesting coming from. So last year, before I started working at Charm, I was also basically just building out my own community online of developers. That is definitely the biggest feedback that I've gotten from whether they're new to development or experienced developers is that it's lonely and it's really hard to find new contributors and really hard to find users. So pretty much I knew that those are like big issues starting with DevRel. So the initiatives that I've been doing at Charm is pretty much to entirely support our community so that people that are in the community feel like they're being heard and they're being seen. And I'm pretty much just, the approach is basically just like use our platform to find more people that think like you or have the same interests that you can network with, right? So we actually just this week launched our another community YouTube channel where it's just for more casual, like we'll be doing, if we're doing any events, we'll be doing like really casual streams on there, using it as a platform for people to talk about their projects if they're looking for contributors or looking to kind of like, extend that olive branch for anyone who's looking to take part. I'm excited to be able to provide that for people. And I think streaming is one great way that you can feel, I think, less alone when you're building open source or when you're building your own projects. And I also think building community is a lot of work. And so it's definitely not going to be for everyone to start building out their own community through a stream and stuff like that. But I'm shocked at how many open source projects are starting to kind of dedicate those resources to like building their own communities. I'll use Capuchin as an example, the theme that I use that TJ actually introduced me to. They have an insanely active Discord. I had no idea. I joined their Discord recently. It's constant. They're like hanging out in the voice channels. They're constantly talking. And I was like, you know what? This makes me feel like I'm part of this team, even though like I haven't even contributed yet. And it inspired me to contribute to the project because I was like, I want to be in on it.
You need to have a bit of a vision for your project, I think, and a vision for the community. Yeah. So build the community you want to participate in.
Yeah.
And that becomes infectious because you're then inviting others to interact with you, to engage, and that's a great factor in open source where suddenly all your efforts are multiplying because suddenly you have fans of your product, of the community even that you're building there, and they're inviting their friends and they're inviting other people, and that's just perfect if you figure out how to do that right, and if you're that interactive with your community, that's perfect.
Or just finding a community to take part in, like a maintainer doesn't have to be the streamer. Like I'm not the BDFL for NeoVim. That's Justin.
Yeah.
I'm a core member. Yeah, sure. But like, okay, but I'm not the maintainer. I'm like a member or whatever. I don't know what you would say. And so like, I think too, the streaming thing, it doesn't even have to be that you're streaming. It could just be cool that someone in your community is doing that, or someone's or like they've got a Discord or they've got some other thing, and finding ways to like participate in those things. Like I've got a lot of viewers. Shout out to like Connie is one of my favorite viewers, one of my core members for Telescope, does an incredible amount of work. And so it's fun when Connie shows up, we talk about Telescope, what we're going to do, blah, blah, blah. And like everyone in chat is like spamming clap for Connie.
Yeah,
that's nice. Connie doesn't have to stream. Connie doesn't want to stream. You know what I mean? Like Connie just wants to get some work. It's like, okay, cool. And so I think it doesn't even have to be that you're the one that's literally doing it, right? I think like finding those communities can be a way to make that community sustainable, even if you're not the face of that thing, right? I was like, I didn't make NeoVim, guys. You know, they come in and they're like, thanks for NeoVim. I'm like, you're talking to the wrong dude. I'm like, I'm sure this is just a Wendy's, you know, like, you know, that kind of, like that kind of thing. You know, you got the wrong guy. But I think those things can help make that community sustainable in the long run, even if it's not the maintainer necessarily doing it.
Yeah.
And then that's something that helps you as well, because this has a huge psychological effect. Then you're suddenly realizing there are more people that are actually benefiting from everything you do, from all the work that you put in, and it suddenly it becomes less lonely. And because I often hear that from other maintainers, from other projects, that it's they almost fear new issues, because that always means there's something wrong in your software. And now this almost sounds depressive, right? So shout out to everyone out there. If you're a user of an open source project and you're happy with it, just write a thank you to the developers. That goes a long, long way.
It's
you have
so
no idea
cool
how
getting an email from someone from like
Yeah.
some completely random place in the world. You know, like, I'm just a dude. I live in the Midwest of the US, you know, like small town US. And like someone emails me from Japan and they're like, I was using Telescope and it's great. And you're like, what? All the way across the world, you know, like awesome. You know, so totally just like getting an email or having an issue open saying
just a
thanks.
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. And like what you're saying too, it's hard because like issues are a lot of the way that you interact with your community for a lot of projects, and they're pretty much always negative, rightfully so, in the sense like that there's something that you would like fixed or a feature request or whatever. And so like okay, but there's lots of people like happy every day with the library or the product, right? You know, like you're like, I mean, I use NeoVim every day, never had to make an issue. You're like, okay, yeah, well, that's somebody you never get to meet unless there's some other avenue to meet them, which is why like Stream or Discord or whatever is really fun, really fun.
Yeah, I super agree with that.
Yeah, I guess I'm lucky because I get like those thank you notes every now and then, so no complaints there.
Well deserved, Carlos. Well deserved.
Yeah, sure. All of you. No,
Carlos, well, it's not fair though. You just write code that works every time. And some of us are more, you know, like we get issues like this is broken, you know, so it's not fair.
Well, I get those issues too. Don't worry about it.
When you look at the issues on Garly, it's just enhancements, no bugs, just enhancements.
No, it's just thank yous, and they're left open. It's like 100 open issues, just thank yous. I didn't have time to close them all today. My fingers were getting tired from clicking.
I wish.
One day.
It's a really interesting point about so we were talking about how monetization might be a great way that we can support sustainability in open source, but there's also this side that's just fulfillment and like being happy being a developer. I think a lot of people, especially when they become like a full-time developer professionally, it's like, okay, now this is work. Whenever they're coding, it's like, oh, it's work now. And then there's no longer that like it's supposed to be fun, right?
I had an interesting talk with a friend. An interesting talk with a friend the other day where they had a project and it just started out as a hobby project. They just fulfilled their own needs, and then they had an idea and they quickly hacked something together, and it was a bit messy, but then it suddenly became popular. And then there's a bit of a switch. Like at first there's like you're self-motivated, you want to hack on something, you want to figure out if you can solve this problem, if it works, if it makes your life better. I don't know what it is, right? But then as soon as there are others depending on it, suddenly it's becoming a job, and suddenly all this motivation is killed by that fact, by that realization. And that's a very, very weird thing, just psychologically, how that works in your brain, where I'm so excited to work on this, and suddenly like, oof, all the energy is gone. And because now I feel like it's an obligation. It's not something I want to do anymore. It's something I have to do.
There's that pressure that now your name is associated with this thing that people love, and if you break it, now they hate you. You know?
Exactly. It was just a fun thing, and suddenly you have like 2,500 dependents. And whenever you change something, you have to like, okay, now it's stressful. I have to figure out, am I breaking existing use cases? Am I everything that comes with it. And that can be a real killer. So be careful with that. At the same time, don't let that ruin your fun. If it's just a hobby project and nobody's paying you for it, yes, try to do your best to keep APIs backwards compatible and everything. But there's no obligation. All right.
Yeah.
You don't have a contract to fulfill.
Right. They can pin the version. Exactly.
User autocomplete to the license file.
And if they want that service, then they should
Right.
start paying you. And suddenly
Right.
it's a different.
lot.
Then we're talking again.
And then it's a
Yeah.
that had me thinking though, Muesli, because I've been working on an open source project. So OpenAI just open sourced Whisper, like their transcription service, and a friend of mine on Twitter who was not technical, but he's been acting kind of as a PM on a project, and I've been contributing to. He was like, this would be amazing for journalists or less technical users who would be able to have like an easy way to transcript this, but the manual process of building Whisper and running it is out of scope for a lot of people. And so we're working on like an open source thing of trying to make this to solve this problem and make it much easier for people. And when you were talking about this, that reminded me of that, because I was thinking, if I were paid to be working on that and kind of contribute that in my free time, I could feel that becoming overwhelming. But I think that there is something to be said about the fact that whether you're getting paid to do it or not, if you are getting paid to do it, that's amazing. But also to have the side projects and the side things that you do that aren't part of your day job, that you don't see as like, this is work. Because I know for me, even in other careers I've had where I'm like, oh, I always wanted to do this for a living. Now I'm doing it, but it's work, right? And it's different. It's good to have hobbies, right? It's good to have like side hustles and side projects and things you do that are not directly tied to maybe always like a financial payment, because to what you were saying, Bash, like there is like this great feeling that can come out about, getting that feedback. Like that can be really, really fulfilling. But I think maybe just hearing you talk musically, like maybe that's something that can help, is like having a separation, right? Having the side projects that we do that aren't tied to our day job and that aren't tied to like whether we eat or not,
Yeah.
And it's also important for your creativity, because that means you can get to do crazy things that you wouldn't be able to do in the other context, in a professional context.
That's why I put on all of my like sponsor tiers, they're just thanks for things. So like there's no expectation. Like I think this is good. Like this is a tip that I would give to other maintainers, unless you have a project that's popular enough that someone's going to sign $10,000 a month SLA with you to make sure that it's working. Okay, well then you should probably have some guarantees. That's fair.
Yes.
But like if it's just for, if it's just like $1 a month from random people and you're like, say thanks, that feels a lot different. You get some money at the end of the month, you're like, sweet, I can buy my wife ice cream out, and I'm like, remember when you let me go code downstairs? Like, and but like that's one of my tiers, is like, this lets me buy my wife ice cream this month. It's like that's the tiers, because it's kind of like a joke, it's a sacrifice for her to like let me do these things and stuff like that too, right? So it's like, but that's a really different expectation than like, I will work this many hours on Telescope this month. I don't make those promises to people online. I would for the right price, though, probably.
Sure.
If you're out there.
I agree. I don't do that either. Not for $1.
That's actually, that brings me to a different issue that I wanted to talk about with you as a group, because I'm interested in your experience, because it very much depends on a country by country basis. It's completely different. And that's, in my experience, there are many open source projects that actually found people who are willing to donate money to them, companies that are willing to donate money to them. And then they figure out, I'm actually in no position to accept that money, because I'm not a legal entity that's allowed to receive donations even. And I can't just make up invoices for people to balance out my donations, right? So that's something I had this discussion so many times, where people are like, okay, I got this project, I have someone who's willing to give me money, but I don't even know where to start, what to do. Is this tax evasion? Do I need my own legal entity? How do I do my taxes? And it's a nightmare to start out. What are your experiences with that?
Yeah, for me, since I'm working like remotely for a while, in Brazil, you kind of have to like open your company. So I have a legal entity, I pay an accountant.
Interesting.
All those things. And then like I receive the sponsors, etc., through my company that I already have set up. So that just works basically. I have like a couple of things that I have to do every month, like issuing like Brazilian invoices, which are like I don't know how to explain, but are related to taxes, basically the tax documents.
Yeah.
So I have to do that every month.
A tax advisor.
But, yeah, but other than that, it just works. So, but it
Okay,
costs a
interesting.
bit of money too. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never paid taxes in my life. No, I'm just kidding.
I wish I were you.
What are these things you gotta talk about? No, for me, at least in the US, you just basically claim it like as income and you just pay taxes on it separate, like later at the end of the year.
Interesting.
But like I have an accountant that manages that and makes sure that I don't commit any illegal activities, and I just track.
Yeah.
I mean, in the US at least, like GitHub sends you a form with the stuff that you can send in to make sure you pay the taxes. So
It's similar in Canada.
Yeah, my advice is get an accountant.
Yeah, getting it
Yeah,
right.
most
Yeah.
certainly. Yeah.
It's so
Yeah.
true. Unless
But-
your work is like you've got one employer, then you maybe
Right.
don't. But like as soon as you get like that multiple streams of income, you have to have an accountant. It's so much work to try and do it yourself. I did it myself last year. Last year or the year before. Like I was a contractor for a while, and I was having to do that, and it was so much work. I was reading government documentation on like taxes and stuff, and I was like, okay, I think next time I just pay somebody who knows how to do this.
Yeah.
I don't know how it is in your countries, but in Brazil, you actually have to like install and run the software within. The last time I tried, it was like in Java 6, like those
Oh God.
JWT
Jesus.
stuff, you know, like the worst thing ever. They override like keyboard shortcuts. So if you run on a Mac, like Command C, Command V doesn't work. All
Oh
that.
God.
And if you lose focus, it like clears the field you're typing on. So if you have to copy numbers, you have to like to carefully like put windows side by side and all that. It was like so painful. I did that one time, and I've been paying accounting.
You're like never again. You're like
Yeah.
never again.
No, I will never install that thing again in my life. Hopefully.
speaking of software, that should be
Worst.
open source. Like
Right,
that sounds
right.
like that could
For
use
real,
some
for real.
contributors.
It could. One thing I was gonna say though, like, because you're right, it can be such a challenge. You're like, people are willing to give me money, but I don't even know where to start accepting it, and I don't know what the
Yeah.
legalities are in my country, and the tax implications can be different country to country, and accepting stuff from different places, and do I need to have a merchant account and this and that. This is one area where, I mean, and there are trade-offs to this, but I think when you look at things like, the GNOME Foundation and the, Apache Software Foundation and, the Software Freedom Conservancy and things like that,
Yes.
the FSF, those can be really useful. And sometimes people, even myself, have sometimes been critical of some of those umbrella groups. And you're like, why do you need this? But the reality is a lot of times you do, because they handle a lot of that management. And yeah, it might.
Yeah.
What's great about GitHub sponsors is great because you can give directly to the projects, which is really good. And it can be difficult sometimes, like when I've wanted to contribute to GIMP or something, like I have to write add a note, to my donation that this is where I maybe want it to go, because the way those things are structured, they can't always. It can be more difficult sometimes for them from a compliance perspective to directly, allocate funds. But the reason those foundations exist is exactly to kind of solve that problem.
Absolutely.
And I maybe we should do more about that, or but that's there. I hope we have other solutions too, but those organizations are really important for those reasons we talked about, because they do a lot of that heavy lifting. Also, many times they offer support and maybe legal help and stuff, which can be really useful.
Absolutely.
But the bureaucratic stuff of just being able to accept money is, like somebody mentioned that earlier, that can be such a big barrier to all of this. And companies, even, like, one of the reasons companies don't give more, not always, sometimes they just don't prioritize it. But their accountants are telling them, if we're going to give money
Yes.
for something, their accountants are saying we need to have this follow these certain guidelines. And if it's too many hoops to jump through, no matter how much you want to contribute to this library that you depend on,
Yeah.
if it's gonna take a couple of days of work and have to jump through a lot of hoops, let's just be honest, most people aren't going to do it.
So,
And
so
it's
here's my dream, Christina. I want a foundation, and I've actually been involved with Tech Cultivation, the Center for the Cultivation of Technology is the full name. That's a Berlin-based, Germany-based foundation who's working to get open source projects accepted as not-for-profit entities.
Nice.
work as a fiscal sponsor, host, basically an umbrella for multiple projects. And then you're in a situation where companies can donate to you and you can actually make that tax deductible.
Oh,
Because
and then you could get matches too, like corporate matches. That would be, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And then if once that's a reality, I think that could be a game changer, because then it means I can hand out that money much more easily. I have a proper receipt for it. And it's even tax deductible in the
and writing like $10,000 check to that company versus like random guy on the internet is like way easier to convince your finance department. You're like,
absolutely.
Okay, so we're just gonna send 10 grand. And they're like, okay, all right, that's not tons of money. Okay, but just this PayPal link. Like, okay, never mind. Like that's not gonna work.
That doesn't sound fishy at all.
And then it's a photo of me or TJ like holding a dog.
Right, like we know it's him because he held up a piece of paper.
Right.
Or like he showed us this. It says open source champion right here, and so he showed us this. Like that's how we know it's okay. That doesn't fly for accounting departments, rightfully so.
And then another avenue that I wanted to mention is those foundations typically can help you as well, even if you're not part of their umbrella, but they can help you identify funding opportunities, because there are lots of grants out there. I just want to, like an LNet in Europe is pretty big. There's the Prototype Fund in Germany. Horizon 2020 is like a European Union wide program, which you can apply for with your open source projects. And there are actually budgets with lots and lots of money, which you can apply for. You just need to write a bit of an application, say what you're doing with this open source project, why the public is benefiting from it, and what this grant would allow you to do. What would you do with this money, essentially? And it's a lot easier to get accepted for those grants than most people imagine. You just have to do it. You have to go through the process. Can be a bit annoying, but you can get a ton of money for your open source project very, very easily. Explore those routes. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead, Bash.
I was just gonna say, somebody in the chat just mentioned the buy me a coffee thing, or for smaller devs, how that's helpful and that's nice. I actually just wanted to give another praise to GitHub sponsors. Like, I know Tej had praised it earlier, but one thing that's big for me, as you guys know, I go by an alias online, like Bash Bunny, for safety reasons and all that good stuff, being a female on the internet. And one thing that I found that is a big issue is a lot of donation platforms will actually...
They require your legal name, right?
They require your legal name. And privacy is not a huge concern for them.
Nope.
So it's actually a big issue. I actually didn't accept any donations or anything like that. I don't use any donation platforms for my Twitch. Basically, I'm like, okay, you can either like, support me through Twitch, or GitHub sponsors is the best way to support me, because it's you're not taking, like, they're not taking a cut, and it's anonymous. It's anonymous for the person who's donating. Like, it's as anonymous as their GitHub profile. It's anonymous for the person who's donating. It's anonymous for the person who's receiving. And I just wanted to give a big shout out to that, because that was really hard to find. And a lot of platforms, like, they don't even disclose what they're going to show like the person who's donating. They don't say what information is being transferred between the parties. So yeah, big shout out. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, that's really good feedback to hear. I'm glad that that's the case, because I know that because I've talked to other people before too, like PayPal. If you want to accept certain types of donations, the person who gives you the money, they get your name, and in many cases they get your address.
Yeah,
people don't know that. Like, so the person who's sending you money, you don't always necessarily get their information, but they get all of yours. And that can be a concern for not just women and marginalized people, but if you are living in a country that might not have that might have some weird political things happening, or more, like there are lots of reasons why you might not want
crazy people.
You're right. There are lots of crazy people. There's lots of reasons you might not want that out there. So and that's another good I think, in addition to the grants, which I'm so glad you brought up, Muesli, because those are things people so often forget about. And like, there are lots of organizations that are dedicated to giving money, and writing the grant can be difficult. That's actually another way people can contribute. I just thought of that. If you're a good writer, I should help write grants for open source projects.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'm going to commit to doing that. If you want my help writing a grant, let me know.
Careful.
No, I'm serious though. But like, yeah, I know I'm probably opening myself up for floaties, but I am actually serious. I'd help. But in addition to that, I think like that's where the anonymity thing, those the umbrella organizations can be really useful because you don't have to,
Absolutely.
dox yourself just so you can, maybe make a little, get a little bit of support off of all the work you're doing.
Yeah.
Speaking of alternative ways too, I'll just throw it out there in case there's people watching this later too. I think something that would be really interesting to see, especially like the world that I'm in is a lot about like streaming and content and stuff like that. I just like to see more companies be like, well, we pay money for like Google ads and stuff or whatever. Why don't we just take some of that money and see if they'll put a little logo for advertising in their videos? Like my audience is basically 100% devs. You don't need spying to find that out. You can just know that someone who's going to watch 6 hours of me coding on a Friday, they're probably interested in software. So if you're a software company, but just like that kind of idea of like thinking about how could we not just do donations, which is good, right? Like donations are cool, or support contracts, but even thinking about other ways that you can reach out and support the people making the projects that you really like that's advertising. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's also an easier sell, I think, in some cases too, because you're getting something back, which is fair. I don't think there's anything wrong with that,
No.
and lots of like there's lots of really sweet tech companies using really cool stuff. Like let's say you're using Zig, right?
Yeah. We love Zig.
Sponsor Andrew Kelly, or see if you could pay the Zig Foundation for minutes of advertising on his stream or on Andrew's stream, or like on oh no, I forgot his name. The other Zig guy that's on Twitch all the time who does the awesome community stuff, and I've rated him a bunch of times, and his name's escaping me. But him too.
So bad with names.
But like there's stuff like that I think like that can also be an easier sell, and also is like really cool because there's no sort of like extra strings attached, right? You're basically just saying like put our name here, like mention us once or something like that, and you don't have to do additional support. Like you were going to stream anyways working on Zig, and we trust you to make Zig awesome, so like just keep making Zig awesome and like mention us once. That seems pretty, that seems good, like if you're in alignment with those goals. So I think there's like lots of interesting ways going on in the future too for these like completely alternate strategies that you never would like. Who's going to pay advertising for like into a open source project? Like that would seem really goofy like 10 or 15 years ago, but like I get a lot of developer wash hours every month.
That's really smart, actually. That's a really good that's a good thing. And again, I think that for a lot of places that they might not be able to do kind of like a ongoing thing, like they can say, yeah, but this is a marketing expense. This is something that I can very easily and
one-time campaign.
One-time campaign, but also I can very easily, sometimes maybe sell this because there are some people in companies who don't understand the value of open source, and you don't even have to talk about that aspect of it, right? We're tricking them, right? Like Sarah Novotny, who's at Microsoft and is amazing, and she was at Google for a really long time. She's one of my favorite people in the world because she is so good at getting like internal, like very corporate people to do the right things by open source, by kind of like making the business argument for them. And that's kind of what you just did, which is you're like, hey, we've got this audience that's targeted to our customer. This is what we should do. You don't even have to get into the like, oh, but look at how good it is and look at how it's good for the ecosystem. Sometimes you don't even have to like make that argument. Just like do the easy sell, and everybody wins.
It's hard for them to understand. Like coding is weird.
It is.
Coding is super weird. Like, and I also don't understand anything about like building maintenance, right? But like if someone who's an expert in building maintenance says, this is how we do a good job at building maintenance, and I was like running a company, I'd be like, cool, well then let's buy that. You know what I mean? I don't need to get convinced about the goodness of that thing, right? So like I feel like the same thing, like what you're saying for like open source stuff, like why would they need to understand why open source is good? That's like a technical expertise kind of question, and it's I think wrong to assume that like everyone can have technical expertise in everything. That's not a feasible thing, right? But you can convince them maybe that it's a reasonable like thing and good for your company. That's a maybe easier sell. So that's something that I think would be really interesting to see over the next few years. Like McDonald's buys little patches on soccer players' jerseys or whatever. Maybe not soccer players. I don't know. Probably soccer players too. But like, get a jersey for your favorite streamer or your favorite content creator, right? And like they're sponsored by us because we think they're doing good stuff and we want our name there. Sweet. I'll be interested to see if that happens.
Yeah,
absolutely. And coming back to something we said before, oftentimes open source projects are a technical advanced solution, right? And then don't highlight that it's open source, just highlight that it lets you do your job more efficiently. Yeah.
Yes.
That's the better sell.
Yeah.
I think part of the problem is that we developers don't know how to sell things.
Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah.
So bad at it.
It's part of the problem.
This is true. Yeah. No, and not only that, but some developers actively push against anything they see as marketing, which I think is a mistake because we are all impacted by marketing. Like I see comments on Hacker News all the time where people are like, I hate marketing and I'm never impacted by advertising. And I'm like, you are a liar because we all are. We are all impacted by all of this. And there's nothing wrong with that. But yeah, developers aren't always good at selling themselves or advertising or making the use case. But I think, again, like that's why what's potentially really beautiful about open source is that community, you can have people, in your community who can help with that, where they're like, look, my value might not be that I'm the person who can commit the most code and I'm not going to be Carlos and have like nothing but, like just PRs thanking me, right? Like I don't have things working. I'm not making amazing, NeoVim plugins all the time on stream that become super popular projects, right? But what I can do is I can help translate, the use case to normies or to business people or to corporations, right? There are people, I promise you, in your audience who are using your product who can see that. And maybe that's an opportunity too, to help things feel more, we keep using the word sustainable, but make it more sustainable, but also like less lonely and less stressful, just be like, hey, if you have this ability, help us write the marketing copy for the website, help us, do some decks or have some talking points if we do have conversations with corporations who are coming in on your own time, like advocate for what this is, but in the language is going to resonate. Like I promise you, there are people in your communities and in your user base, even if they don't think of themselves as active community members, who have those skills. And to mention like what Abby was saying earlier, there are these things that we can do, I think, to make to get more people involved and contribute. It doesn't always just have to be about like what janitorial work was I doing for cleaning up code and maintainership, or how much, how many lines of code am I committing and how many bugs am I squashing, right? Like there can be other ways that we can, if you don't have those skills, I promise there are people in your user base who many times would be very willing to help. We just have to let people know that that's an option.
Yeah,
absolutely. Sorry, Besh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I'd be very curious to, I guess, plant that seed with GitHub as well. Of like, I feel like it's not super obvious when people think GitHub and they're looking at issues and things like that. It's not super obvious what like non-code contributions can be.
You're right.
Yeah. And I feel like there's definitely potential for GitHub to improve on that. Even like, while you were explaining that, I was like, oh, maybe it would be worth like, opening up discussions in some of the projects that you're involved in and being like, hey, is anybody interested in doing some technical writing for us for, XYZ? But then how do the projects know even like what to create that, like where that writing would be valuable? I feel like there's this whole other kind of underlayer of being able to garner support for a project that requires that kind of business language that people aren't really aware of, like the value of it or how it can affect the project, So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm going to take that feedback back because I think about this too. And I think there are definitely things we could do to improve that. And I'm going to take this back to communities teams, especially, and be like, hey, what can we do to highlight the non-code things? That's a great suggestion. I make no promises, but I think you're right, because these are interesting things to think about and interesting challenges to solve, but I think could potentially be good for everybody.
Cool.
Did you have something you wanted to say, Muesli?
Yeah, I just want to say, try to be more inclusive. Oftentimes, as developers, especially, we tend to forget that a project is so much more, and the documentation goes a long way. If I have a good documentation of my code, of my APIs, that resolves dozens of
So
tickets
much.
before they've ever been created, because you've already
Yes.
answered the question in your documentation. And we should value that, and we need to recognize the work done by others there. Documentation, translations, but also UX, UI, stuff like that. And they're just as important as all the technical aspects of your project. So value
Yes.
that, invite others to join you there if you need help. I know it's incredibly hard finding people in the open source scene, because it's just something we're getting to very, very slowly. I know how hard it is to find UI, UX experts for KDE, for GUIs, for open source projects in that area. But we're also doing a bad job at integrating them in our projects, and we have to do a lot to learn there as developers.
Yeah, we forgot that a lot of POs and like people that don't work directly like writing software don't even know how to use GitHub. They don't even understand
Right.
Exactly.
issues
Yes,
or descriptions
exactly.
around that.
And that's
Yeah,
why it's
no,
important to also have other avenues for
Yes.
your community to engage with.
Mhm.
Slack,
Absolutely.
Discord, IRC, whatever it is. Yeah, Twitch.
Yeah.
Streaming.
Discord has been, I don't know about the rest of you. I think the Discord has been such like a game changer for a lot of community building and open source stuff. Like, you know, I know some people will be like, oh, it's just, you know, IRC. It's like, no, it's not. There's a community layer. There's like a quickness. There's so many people who use it. I'm in so many different Discords for a lot of different projects and various communities. I'm curious, especially, you know, since, Muesli, especially since like you've been around since the 90s, has that been your experience that you've seen more activity in these areas thanks to kind of the emergence of some of these different, you know, social platforms? Or
Yeah, as well. I mean, and also there's an entire ecosystem. It always depends a bit on the language that you're working with,
Sure.
right? For C++, it's very different
Of
compared
course.
to Rust, Go, whatever.
Right.
But yes, absolutely. There's been a bit of a shift, and the ecosystem is evolving there. So it's a lot easier for translators to contribute nowadays. It's a lot easier for people who are writing documentation to contribute. But there's still, I mean, there's so much more contributors that are writing code compared to everything else, at least in my experience with my open source projects. It's hard to come by good translators, good technical writers, and but as I mentioned, we also need to do a better job at integrating those people once they are around, and to value their work, because it's incredibly valuable.
Incredibly valuable.
It's happening, but it's a slow shift. And yes, in the 90s, or even like 10, 15 years ago, it's been a lot different. It's been mostly 99% programmers. And nowadays, in the bigger open source projects, suddenly you have UX experts who are trying to get involved, and the technical writers who are taking care of the documentation. Yes, that's all happening. I'm just looking at KDE here as an example. A lot has changed in recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good takeaway as well. Like I'm gonna look at what we're doing for our non-code contributors and make sure that we're incorporating something in our community for that, because it's a great point, and it's not, as I mentioned, like it's not super present or obvious on GitHub. Like there is where we're getting all the code contributions, but I do think that there's definitely some space for us to do more for people who are like maybe not contributing code, but contributing more technical content. I know that we've gone like much way over the expected end time, but I mean, I've really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you all so much for coming and for being here, for sharing such great ideas. And I think I'm really, really pleased with how the conversation was able to just flow today. So big kudos to all of you for being so chatty. Great job there. And thank you. Thanks again for showing up. And if there are any links, I do have links to all of their GitHubs in the description. And if there are any other socials that you wanted to mention or anything like that, I know you can see some of their different, like you can see TJ's Twitch, Carlos and Film Girls, Twitters and all that stuff. So feel free to go give them some follows if you're interested in hearing more about what they're sharing and doing on the internet. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you. Thanks a million for all of you being here and showing up and making it such a smooth process and bearing with my technical difficulties pre-go live.
No worries.
Hey, thanks for the invite, Bash. It's always fun hanging
Yeah,
out.
thanks for the invite.
Yeah.
Great talking.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great connecting with all of you. I was genuinely, thank you. This is such a good conversation.
Yeah, happy to
Awesome.
talk
Thank
more
you.
about it some other time too. I mean, there's so much left
Absolutely.
for us to talk about. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
really excited to see what's going to happen with open source and exploring. And ultimately, one last piece of advice I have is just make sure you're trying to have as much fun as you can with open source. Remember, that's a lot of
Mhm.
unless your
Absolutely.
project should
Yeah.
be making $1 million a year, just try and remember how to have fun with it. If it should be making $1 million a year, just do that for a few years and then you can do whatever you want afterwards. You
Yeah.
can just
Also,
retire.
also
Listen to
hire a
Teach.
business manager.
Yes,
hire a
right,
business
like hire a
manager.
PM. Yeah, like do other stuff.
And an accountant.
Just get some technical, but like
Yes.
otherwise just have some fun and explore and enjoy yourself. It's such a wonderful, blessed world that we can like write code and people all over the world can benefit and do all this stuff with it. It's just such a crazy time to be alive and very thankful for all the opportunities I have. So that's my last little piece of advice.
Agreed.
Absolutely. Nice
Agreed.
closing words there.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. I'm going to change the scene so that I'll end the call just now. Okay.
Thanks,
Bye,
Bash.
guys.
Thanks, Bash.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Oh, lols. Lols. All right, we go to end screen instead because I realized that I can't leave the call without my camera dying. So that's fine. But I hope that all of you really found that discussion valuable. And I honestly, that was such a great chat. I have a lot of takeaways from that conversation. I'm definitely going to be sharing that all around the socials because I think that's a really, really great conversation to reflect on, and super interested in hearing all of your guys' takes as well. I know that we're pretty, in depth in the conversation during the stream. So we didn't really get to keep up with what was going on in chat too much. But if any of you are interested in kind of, sharing some of your takeaways or sharing things that you would like to see even discussed in the future, feel free to join the Slack and let me know in the Slack so I can actually schedule something along those lines. It's honestly got me so excited to write some more code today or do some stuff for our non-code contributors. Like, I feel like it's so often overlooked in open source projects and they can bring so much value. And it was great hearing the insights from people at like kind of in all different areas and all different levels of experience. And 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10. And thank you all for joining. You're all great to have here. So thank you for supporting. And all that good stuff. Cappuccino staff were glued to the screen for this one, hoping to take on some of the advice mentioned here and applying it to Cappuccino. Anytime. Very excited to see what comes of this, and definitely. So as Abby mentioned, stay tuned for the GitHub Universe. So both Jay-Z and I will be at GitHub Universe in person, and so if any of you are going to be there, again, let us know in the Slack. The Slack link redirects to Discord. Okay, good. I haven't officially launched the Discord yet, but you can totally join the Discord. So we actually have, if that's redirecting now, then welcome to the Discord, because we're actually moving from Slack to Discord. So welcome. Got him. Bamboozled. Enjoy. Yeah, we're excited about that. I didn't realize that was already active though. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, and if there's anything that you want to see happen. We've got some fun events that we're planning for GitHub Universe, and I'm super excited to announce those a little closer to the date. And we'll be keeping you guys in touch with what's going on there. And for sure, if there's any follow up that is related to this topic, we'll be sure to highlight it in a future YouTube video as well. Okay, I'll stop rambling. I'll let you guys get on with your days. But yeah, join the Discord. Y'all are the first ones getting in the Discord. So if you use the charm.sh/Slack link, it's actually going to bring you to our Discord, which is, bamboozled. So yeah, enjoy that, and I'll see you guys next time. Okay, bye.